Corruption defines politics today, Afra. Of course, this is something that you've focused mostly on in your home countries of Trinidad and Tobago. You're a surveyor, if I'm not mistaken, who saw corruption in the bidding process and then became a whistleblower. What happened and how did your expertise help you uncover this?
Okay. Well, I'm a surveyor, which in America we call an appraiser. So I look at real estate, I do viability studies of projects, and I run a firm. I run a private firm, okay? So that's my training. I trained in England and in Trinidad and Tobago. And part of the work involves maintaining the integrity of the process, because surveying is the science of measurement. So we want to measure the various inputs into the construction and development process and the outputs. So that is what we were doing. In our firm, we have a no corruption policy, but my work took me into the public domain, which is beyond the work of the firm. So there's work within the construction and real estate sector that we can talk about. There's work within the financial sector, because the biggest financial meltdown took place in 2008, 2009, and there's been a colossal bailout of the hugest financial entity in the Caribbean, and I've been a leading campaigner on that. So there's also that aspect of my work, because part of training to be a surveyor is to become financially literate and read financial statements and make sense of it all.
Of course. Let's go back to how we got there in 2008. Kind of lead us into that collapse economically in that region.
What we had happening at that time was the group was called CL Financial. CL is Colonial Life, was the insurance company founded in Trinidad and Tobago in 1937. It's an indigenous insurance company founded by people of African descent. Black Caribbean people founded it, and it was an outstanding success. Colonial Life diversified and set up a group called CL Financial that was a parent company, and they diversified into four main areas. One of them was alcohol. So they bought a liquor company in Jamaica. They bought liquor companies in the southern states of the USA that do bourbon. They bought liquor companies in France. They were international. There was energy. There was a plant producing methanol out of our gas supplies in the country, because the country is oil and gas rich. Thirdly, there was real estate. It was the country's biggest housing developer, luxury housing, middle income housing. And fourthly, there was finance, which was banking and insurance. They were the majority shareholder of the biggest bank in the Caribbean, which is called Republic Bank. And they also owned Clico and other financial concerns, four of which ended up requiring a bailout, which is how come we arrived at a bailout on the 30th of January of 2009. That bailout was wreathed in political corruption, because it was discussed and agreed behind closed doors. We later discovered that the Minister of Finance who negotiated the bailout, which is a lady called Karen Nunes Teixeira, I will call names. She is an attorney at law, former lecturer of law, and in fact was a shareholder of CL Financial. She was later revealed by my research to be a shareholder of CL Financial that she was negotiating the bailout of. There was also corrupt dealings in the sense that, as it stands now, about 25 or 26 billion of our dollars have been committed to the bailout. And that money was committed in a scenario with no interest. So people have attempted, foolishly in my view, to compare the Trinidad and Tobago bailout of CL Financial with the Wall Street bailout that was done when President Bush and President Obama and those other leaders were there before. And it's different, because all of those companies in America that were bailed out were made to pay punitive rates of interest. They were made to give up their shares. And that is how come the American Treasury was able to recover some of the money that was put in to help those companies, including the companies in Detroit and so on. In Trinidad and Tobago, that didn't happen. So we've waited virtually a decade, because it was end of January of 2009. We're now in the middle of January, third week of January of 2019. We've waited virtually a decade, and there's no interest to be collected. There was only interest on the first 5 billion at a very tiny rate of interest, half the rate of interest prevailing at the time. So those are the broad elements of the corruption that underline the deal. So from March of 2009, I've been writing about it. I've written more about it than anybody else. I took the government to court because in Trinidad and Tobago, we have legislation, Freedom of Information Act, which is very modern And I used it with my attorneys, who are powerful attorneys and no-nonsense people, and I sued to get the details of the bailout. Because as far as I'm concerned, that bailout involved the use of vast sums of public money. And I'll give you a proportion. The American bailout, when Mr. Geithner, Timothy Geithner, was interviewed by the Congress, and he was asked, what is the cost of the bailout to the American economy? It was live on TV, it's online, and so on. His reply was that it was about between 1% and 3% of the GDP of America, so the bailout. Our bailout costs between 10 and 13% of our GDP. So it's vastly different quantity of money. No interest was put into the agreement, and the people who caused this collapse have really gotten away scot-free because the government purchased their debt.
Who's involved in this? Does it bleed into the upper echelons of the government there?
Of course, because what is happening here, just like America, we have a tic-tac, a Mutt and Jeff political system. So we have one party over here and another party over here, and we're taught to believe that they're way different from each other. And I don't hold that view. Okay, I don't hold that view at all. They're very similar to each other. And in fact, in both cases, there were senior members of cabinet who were on boards of the companies that collapsed. So in the government before the present one, which was called the People's Partnership, the Minister of Planning and Development, which was a gentleman called Dr. Bohendradat Tiwari, he was on the board of the parent company for 14 years. He was head of the audit committee, and they only had 3 meetings in 14 years. Okay. In the current government, which is the People's National Movement, and they were elected in September of 2015, which is the other party over here, the Attorney General, the sitting Attorney General, was on the board of Clico Investment Bank, which is one of the 4 companies that collapsed, that had to be rescued. And that company hadn't filed tax returns for 3 years, and they kept their banking license. So there's wrongdoing and odd behavior all the way around the table, to answer your question.
Let's go back a little bit further to around the 70s, 1970s. You talk about how the country incurred a huge wealth injection from the oil revenue, but a lot of that was stolen, Afra.
So the oil wealth was stolen, and the main mechanism for stealing that oil wealth, it was either lost or stolen, was in fact what was called government-to-government arrangements. We have always been an oil and gas producing country. The first country in the world to commercially produce oil was Trinidad and Tobago, like 110 years ago. If you go back in the history of it, the first place in the world that oil was pumped commercially and sold was in this little island I'm from. Okay? And that oil and gas price had been bumping along unceremoniously and quite low. And the country was going through the difficulties of independence. We got independence in 1962 of the demands from the population for better services and very modest revenues and so on. And then in 1974, without any of our doing, OPEC was formed, and OPEC took a very biting stance which quadrupled the price of oil. And for people like the United States of America or Canada, which were not net producers of energy, you were net consumers of energy, it resembled a disaster. Because it was a crisis in first world economies and so on. And one of the ways that they figured to get around that crisis was to put in place arrangements and repackage their services, their capital, and sell their capital to countries like ours through mega projects. So in fact, there are a lot of reading on those things. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we had major projects that were started. Some of them were quite unnecessary. One of them that comes to mind is a Mount Hope Medical Complex, which is a medical school. It was built by French. It wasn't all American people. There were French people involved, British people involved, Americans, Canadians. This was built by a French company called Sodetech under a government-to-government arrangement, which meant only French people worked on it. And it's huge. And it's so huge and so unnecessary that, in fact, over half of the buildings in the complex have never been used. And it was finished about 1977 or 78, but it's never used. So this is the kind of monstrous waste of our patrimony that I've been speaking about. And in fact, the Prime Minister in 1982, that was a Prime Minister called George Chambers, was giving a speech about at that time the phrase they used was petrodollars, was about where did the petrodollars go. And he was making the point that his study of it, 2 out of every 3 petrodollars had either been stolen or wasted, which is what you could have seen in my diagram that I spoke about, And we have a similar situation now with the contemporary examples I'm studying and I'm critiquing, that in fact that type of proportional waste is still taking place and it needs to be dealt with. And that takes me to another one of the things that I've been working on, which is a procurement system, a modern system of law for public procurement and the disposal of public property, which myself and my colleagues were working on. And that law has now been passed by the Parliament. And it's about to be implemented. And we're quite excited because we believe it will actually represent a break from the past and a possibility to transact business in a straightforward and ethical manner. And we need to battle to make that a reality.
I guess I'm confused about how this happened, where this corruption is kind of institutionalized within this region, because the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers revealed, obviously, Trinidad and Tobago specialize in protecting, the 0.1%. That wealth that's offshore in these tax havens. How did we get here, though? Why this region?
We've had a lot of excuses about the society being too small and people knowing each other and so on. And I don't think those excuses hold water. I don't think they do, because societies that are smaller than ours. Trinidad and Tobago has a population of about 1.4 million people. Societies smaller than ours have taken decisive action against white-collar crime. I want to say that the turning point will come, and it will come when powerful people go to jail. It's coming as sure as night is follows day. If you look at the region, just to step out of Trinidad and Tobago for a moment, and I know your work in Telesur and so certainly focuses on the region, the Latin American and Caribbean area, South America. There's been a tremendous shift in terms of what's happened in the region, in terms of powerful officials behind bars, presidents and chief justices and so on, that 20 years ago, if we had a conversation 20 years ago, we would have laughed at each other at the thought that a president could be behind bars, which is what we're seeing every week in the news. So the change is there. We're at a very contested moment. We're at a period of tremendous flux, and I'm speaking not just financially in terms of white-collar crime, in a period of tremendous flux in terms of consciousness and political activism. And we have to fight for what's right.
Who are we talking about that's storing money here? What companies, what entities?
Well, it certainly did. I mean, there were companies that people went to the States and established companies and then tendered off-the-shelf companies with one in the office answering your phone, and then tendered for jobs here and made themselves very, very wealthy. Currently, the person I pay the greatest attention to on this issue is Nicholas Jackson, who wrote the Treasure Islands and has now done one on the financialization of the global economy. And his work is tremendous in explaining that the tax havens are really Wall Street, Delaware, and the City of London. The tax havens are not St. Lucia and Barbados and the Cayman Islands. Those are like branch offices. The head office is in Wall Street, the head office is in Delaware, the head office is in the City of London. The Panama Papers are also tremendously encouraging, Abby, because what the Panama Papers say to me is this. When people come to me with a message of despair and apprehension and how can we go forward, I say to them, we need to understand what the Panama Papers meant. The most corrupt people on the planet, the most powerful people on the planet, the Russian mafia, the American multinationals stashing money offshore, drug barons, rock stars who don't want to pay the correct taxes, put FIFA, all of those ultra corrupt people had their money arranged in a certain way that they were sure, kill them dead, they were sure that their money was entirely secure, safe, and out of sight. And if you'd asked any of them, where do you keep your money? In a drunken moment, they would have said, don't worry, I've got a firm in Panama that handles all of my stuff. My stuff is safe. Because Panama was one of those jurisdictions like Luxembourg or Switzerland that was quite private. Somebody in that law firm, Mossack Fonseca, and we don't know if it's somebody or somebody's, somebody in that law firm got fed up, and it may have been a personal slight, it may have been a promotion they didn't get, it may have been somebody who's jilted romantically, we never know. One of those beautiful things about history, when history makes that change in the road, we never know really what inspired the person to make the change. Somebody got fed up and hit a button or two and released a huge, and I think is the largest single leak ever in history in terms of the size of the information that was released. And all of those people, the most powerful people who thought their affairs were entirely compartmentalized from examination, all of their stuff is out. There's a convergence between the world of information, which is suffused with an information war. Glenn Greenwald and all of that stuff, Snowden and so. And the world of finance, and I look at them on a collision course, and I jump back 10 years ago, and I'll throw a question at you, because I know your work is very interesting in this area. Ask yourself this question. If the NSA and the GCHQ have the capacity to examine any email, any telephone call, any voicemail, anything that they want to, because they have all the passwords and the firewalls are just a joke, they can go in and so. Because if the powers that be had the power to say what's happening inside of the Bank of America, what's happening inside of Barclays Bank, how did we have a meltdown? And that meltdown actually was a transfer of wealth from poor people who were saving in their 401k and working people, working stiffs, into that money just went into other people's hands in the same Treasure Islands type of scenario, which again the poor taxpayer had to bail out, which is what you were referring to. So it's part of a process, and that information angle was in collision with the financial angle. Panama was yet another recurrence of that in 2016. So I'm quite optimistic that with work like this, which is very important, and the work I'm doing, my work is at afraraymond.net, I have all my work curated in one place. That with work like this, we can actually inspire people. We will never know who they are, who log in and see things, to do things differently, to think about things differently, because we now have the possibility, for the first time in human history, for all of us to talk with each other.
Right. Well, when you bring it back to the NSA, I mean, you can look at how Edward Snowden, sacrificed his life to tell us about, illegal warrantless wiretapping. But what did we do with the information, Afra? I mean, here we are. We have the information. We know about the Panama Papers. We know about NSA surveillance, yet nothing is done about it. And I don't, it's one thing to have the knowledge. It's another thing to act on it. And when we're talking about the government being, stacked with essentially corrupt individuals who have institutionalized this kind of thievery, what do you find the biggest barriers are to rooting out the corruption?
I mean, I know that some of the prosecutions in Latin America and the Caribbean, the recent ones, like in the last 18 months, have been based on Panama Papers. There's a prosecution taking place right now against the recently elected president of Brazil, his son. And that's taking place like right now on Twitter in the last 6 hours. That is actually taking place under the Panama Papers. So the people are actually feeding into this new zeal.
What are the greatest myths about corruption? I know that you had a TED talk about that, and it's really interesting.
The three greatest myths. The first one is that it's not really a crime. So if you speak with people, most people, and you ask them about crime, they are concerned naturally, because we're human beings, about crimes against the person. So you have rape, you have murder, you have robbery, you have carjacking, and you have bank robbery, and all of that sort of obvious stuff, people with guns and knives, and men with hoods, and so on. Almost no one will mention corruption in the list of crimes. So the first myth is that corruption is not a crime. Now that may seem like sort of an academic point, but really, if the broad population is not convinced that corruption is a crime, what you have is this. So diligent police investigators and prosecutors will assemble a case against powerful business interests and political people to put them in court and prosecute them for corrupt activity. That case in our system has to go to a jury. A criminal prosecution in Trinidad and Tobago goes to a jury. A jury is made up of those people who don't really believe it's a crime. Who's somebody who took advantage of an opportunity. You see, so it's a soft issue.
It's a mindset. You're right.
Exactly. Second point is that people labor under the illusion that it's a minor thing. Okay, I know it's corrupt. But in fact, we got this bridge built, or we got this water supply improved, and maybe somewhere in there, some official took 10%.
The bridge is built? Look, I mean, who cares, right?
That's the price of doing business. That's the euphemism that's used, the price of doing business. But in fact, the research will show, as my research has done, that it's plenty more than 10%. 10% is something that's floated out. There's always plenty more. And the thing with Halliburton and the war in Iraq, and you go into all of that reading, it's huge, the amount of money that's made. And the third myth, which is the one that you and I were just talking about before you asked me to tell you the three myths. The third myth is that we can't do anything about it. And now with this information age, we have access to information and we have an access to communication with each other, because you and I may never meet each other, but we're having this exchange, which is extremely important. We have an access to information, we have an access to communication, and I believe that we are getting to a point in terms of the common humanity, our consciousness and our consciences. We are literally saying we're not taking that anymore. That is emerging now. A new movement is emerging, whether it's Black Lives That Matter or whatever. New sensibilities are emerging that maybe 40 years ago were big. They're now coming back more powerful. We're not taking that again.
Exactly. And as we're becoming more conscious of that, Afra, we're becoming internationalists in our perspective about how these things affect each other. Lastly, for some parting words, why should Americans care about this issue, and what can we do to help your efforts?
Well, Americans should care about the issue because it's really an issue of stability and peace. And all peoples should care for stability and peace. We have a small home, Earth, and we all have to live here. And ultimately, regardless of our color and our race and those things which is nobody's fault, nobody is to blame, nobody is to feel proud about it. We're all human beings. Okay, I'm a Pan-Africanist is my main political sensibility. I don't have any problem discussing this with you. I mean, I have no problem. I have no hang-ups like that. We have to work together to get a better planet. I mean, I would throw at you a quotation from one of the people who really inspires me. Is a Pakistani thinker, Pervez Hoodboy. He's on Twitter's Hoodboy, HWBHOYIST. Pervez Hoodboy is a professor at university in Pakistan. And he's a rationalist, he's a Muslim. But he's fighting against this idea that Islamic idea should control the academy, the faculties, and so on. And he was making a point to students that issues like race, and gender, and religion, and your family, that we hold so fast to, and they become our central identity, and we're here to fight and die over those issues. In fact, objectively, those issues are incidental. None of us control those issues. So we say things we can't help. The things we can help is our perspective and our outlook going forward, how we treat with other human beings and how we deal with the exercise of life to build a better civilization.
Great. Thank you so much for your time and all of your insight. And thank you so much for your work, Afra. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Abby.